In your introduction to the University Unthought, you actually do a very good understanding of the policy decisions which were taken right from the early 2000s till very recently.
Right.
So could you just take our viewers through some of those policy decisions which were taken by the government of India?
I think it goes slightly before the 2000s as well, because until and unless we track that moment of liberalization, right, and which is what leads to, let's say, the opening up of the higher education sector to the market, right? So that is the crucial moment, and which of course happened under the shadow of something called the Washington Consensus of 1989, which basically said that debts are going to be released by these international banking corporations, right? So by these international credit organizations like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank, right? So the third world economies are going to be given debts, right? So in order to tide over their crisis, right, so their economic crisis, right, so debt will be granted by the international financial organizations as long as the third world economies open up their market for multilateral trade. One has to make these structural adjustments within the national economy, within the developing economy, in order for the financial organizations of the developed economies to give out loans to us.
Okay.
Early 1990s was the moment, right, so when the Indian economy is finally opened up to private capital from outside, and which is what we famously know as the turn towards neoliberalism. Now, soon after that, in 1995, right, so there was a private universities bill which was tabled. Now, of course, the bill did not get passed at the center, but several states passed a variant of that bill in their state legislatures. Right? So that is how privatization of higher education began inside the states, though the bill was actually defeated at the center. Right?
Okay.
And this private universities bill of 1995 was basically a set of regulations, right, so which said that there are a lot of these private universities which are being opened up in the country and which are entirely for-profit organizations, and education cannot become. So that the overall rhetoric was that education cannot be for-profit. So therefore, we are going to set some guidelines for private players to come and invest in higher education. Right? So though the rhetoric was that we have to save higher education from private onslaught, actually what it does is that it grants legitimacy to private players by issuing a set of guidelines for them. Then in 2000, of course, we are aware of the Ambani Birla report on higher education. Mukesh Ambani and Kumar Mangalam Birla, right, so were made part of a specific committee which was they were made part of a PM's council, the Prime Minister's Council, and that time, of course, as you would understand, right, so it was the Vajpayee government, right, so they were made part of the Prime Minister's Council to suggest measures in terms of improving higher education, right, so and in April 2000, they finally submit a report, and the gist of the report would be that if the state has a commitment to education, then that commitment must only play itself out in the primary and secondary sectors. Higher education or tertiary education must be left entirely or largely to private capital. And we are talking about a period which is going to lead to something called a jobless growth, right? So where students coming out of universities and colleges would have no job to land in, right? So and yet this is the logic that they are using, that since higher education leads to a job, since higher education leads to higher incomes, lifetime incomes, therefore let the beneficiary pay for his or her own higher education. And if at all a beneficiary doesn't have the social or the economic capital, then we can have loans or scholarships to fund them. Now, there's a horrible problem with this movement from a subsidy model to a loan scholarship model. A subsidy model believes in funding institutions. A loan scholarship model believes in funding individuals. So the logic of funding moves from the institution to the individual. The logic of funding moves from the public to the private. We can already see that in terms of policy, there is a drive towards privatization. Following on the lines of the Ambani Birla report, there's something called a Model Universities Act that gets published by the UGC in 2004, right before the NDA government loses its mandate. This Model Universities Act would go out and say that the model of a good university is one which can generate its own resources. Therefore, higher education must be worked along this model of self-sufficiency. right? So rather than depending on funds from the state. So that's the 2004 moment. Now, soon after the first UPA government, UPA 1 comes into power, because it comes into power riding on the discontent against the Model Universities Act. They come and scrap the Model Universities Act. But in place of the Model Universities Act, they set up a National Knowledge Commission in 2005. And the National Knowledge Commission submits its reports, right? So a series of reports from 2006 to 2009. The National Knowledge Commission was headed by somebody called Sam Pitroda, who we all would be aware of, right? So a telecommunications expert, right? So, and he prepares this flurry of reports, all of which finally go on to argue that funding higher education must entirely be determined by the employability of specific disciplines. Disciplines are going to be funded only as long as they can produce employable graduates, only as long as they contribute to national growth or, let's say, human capital. So you can understand that we are already part of that entire knowledge economy where knowledge has to be primarily looked at within the economic logic of profit and loss. There are several clauses in the National Knowledge Commission reports, right? And there is not a single clause on humanities education. Right, so there is no clause on the humanities disciplines. There is the proposal of setting up something called a hilarious thing called the National Science and Social Science Foundation, and which means nothing basically. Right, so there is an entire section about attracting talented students to maths and science. Right, so but there is nothing on social science, humanities, philosophy, or anything of that sort. Right, so there is some talk about English, but not English literature, but English as a translation industry. Then, of course, in 2009, right, so the Yashpal Committee report, right, so gets submitted. One of the recommendations that the Yashpal Committee had made was that in order to expand access to higher education, the state must set up public universities in relatively remote areas. Right, so there has to be a geographical expansion of higher education in order to ensure democratic access. And this was suggested by the National Knowledge Commission as well. It proposed the setting up of 12 new universities, right, so funded by the state, and following on the NKC and the Yashpal Committee directions, central government institutes 15 new central universities, right, so in 2009. The problem is that, number one, most of these universities are then going to be embroiled in bargains with the state government over land. Most universities could not even have a permanent campus in the first 7 years of their existence. So, for example, a place where I worked, Central University of Bihar, was working out of 2 temporary rented campuses, one in Patna, one in Gaya. These are spaces which are hugely feudal spaces, and it became easy for the administrations at these places to then tap into these local networks of feudal power and privilege. And the everyday language at the universities was the language of feudal privilege. Was the language of, let's say, caste privilege. The final nail in the coffin of higher education was something that got drafted in the form of a Foreign Education Providers Bill. Initially drafted in 2008, it was again raked up in 2013, which basically went out and said that we should allow foreign investors, right, so to come and open off-campus centers here. So in order to prevent capital flight, also a term that Indian policymakers love to death, which is brain drain, right? So in order to, let's say, stem brain drain and capital drain, let us allow foreign universities to come up and open off-campus centers here. It was in 2001 that there was a particular agreement that was made at the WTO conference, right, so which is called the Doha Agreement, and which is where India had offered its higher education sector, right, so for multilateral trade. And of course, along with higher education becoming tradable service, students become paying clientele, teachers become service providers. Therefore, national institutions or public funded state institutions in the country can no longer be subsidized. In order to create a level playing field for private investors to come and invest here. And naturally, right, so where quality education is available at lesser cost, students would want to move there. So the explicit logic that was being used is that there must be a lowering of national subsidies. There must be a lowering of funding for institutions so that off-campus foreign universities can thrive. And this was 2013, from 2014 we know what has been happening. And of course, off late what we have seen is that in 2016 there was a committee that submitted its report for a new national education policy, which again suggested that we link funding with ranking, right? So it is on the basis of the ranking of a particular institution that its funding must also be related.
But Debaditya, isn't there a kind of contradiction there? Because we know that the NIRF rankings, for instance, in the humanities and social sciences, places JNU as the best university in India. And at the same time, the ministries of the, like official spokesperson of the government of India, you know, spell venom on national television about the same university.
Right. I think in terms of policy, these two are absolutely united. Right? So they are actually united moves at heart, right? So, and that is where the paradox lies. So on the one hand, right, so there are all these anti-national institutions which are rated as the best in the country, right? So you would have JNU occupying the second position, right? So IIT Madras, right? So rated as the best institution among the engineering and technology institutes, right? So JNU, you would have DU rated 5th or 7th or something, HCU rated 7th, right? So Jadavpur University rated 8th, something like that. It seems that the best institutions are actually the anti-national institutions, right? But I think this is a very, very concerted policy move. In keeping in mind, right, so what was being suggested by the National Policy on Education draft that was already in place. The National Policy on Education draft, which was earlier the Subramaniam Committee report, that the best institutions must be basically unanchored from state support. By linking ranking with funding, it is saying that not only should we close down the institutions which are lowest on the ranking ladder, but we must also relieve the institutions which are best, which are at the top, right? So we must let them go out and generate their own funds because they are famous enough. Ranking itself becomes one of the ways through which the university is going to be advertised as an investable asset. So basically by doing this, the government is saying that yes, these are anti-national institutions. And by making the anti-national institutions the best institutions, we are trying to privatize them.
Okay.
Right? And this is where, let's say, the BJP's ideological aggression finally comes to play itself out in neoliberal economic policy.